Hello and welcome to the first in a series of webinars hosted by VicNoTill, focusing on relevant issues around soil carbon through a closer look at strategies to increase soil organic matter. This project is supported by Wimmera CMA through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. We'd like to thank them very much for their support. We're very fortunate enough today to be joined by Jade Killoran. Jade is the founder of Healthy Farming Systems and is an independent cover crop advisor and researcher, helping farmers trial, adopt and manage multi-species cover crops on farm. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jane to the webinar. So welcome Jade.
Thank you, Dan. Lovely to be here. I'll just share my screen now and we'll hop right into multi-species cover crops. Can you all see that? So this morning, as Dan has said, so I'm Jade. I'm going to be talking today to you about multi-species fodders and more about the basics of it. So what and when you can sow, and then why you would do so from a soil health and an economic perspective. So it's the bones of the multi-species and some of my trial findings from the last few years. So I've had a few questions lately after my talks, whether I'm independent or how I got to where I've been. So I guess this is just a little slide to explain why I do what I do. When I was at university, I came across cover crops in my third year of uni, and I focused my honours year on multi-species cover cropping in Victoria, in the Victorian High Rainfall Zone. Then I spent 2 years at Southern Farming Systems as a research and extension officer, and 4 years at AGF Seeds as their cover crop or multi-species researcher, and started Healthy Farming Systems after that. So now I consult mainly to CMA and Landcare groups, and on paddock scale trials with them, and also helping farmers sometimes privately with managing and adopting covers. So some of the questions that I look at from a paddock scale trial view is, do they work on real life farms? Are multi-species economically viable? And if so, by how much? What's the scale of their viability, and where and when? And also what paddock scale changes are possible in terms of soil health, and how long do those changes take? So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at multi-species in the paddock and putting them into a trial scenario. So we'll talk a little bit about the what of the multi-species. So really what it boils down to is they're a flexible, diverse sowing of plant species. So that diversity is crucially important. It's what drives the system from a multi-species sense. But there's also an element of protecting and improving the soil, and also providing fodder if we're talking a livestock or a mixed farming system. And that protection and improvement of soil is also what sets a multi-species apart from a more conventional sowing, because there's quite a big focus on that from a management point of view, from the farmer, so that that protection and the improvement of soil really matters, and it makes the whole system work much better. So when we're talking species, I try and put into a mix 5 to 15 species. I think that's quite enough. And annual based, if it's going into what we call a problem paddock, or a paddock that has some sort of constraint. And then when our soil health improves, we'd like to move to a perennial. So we have a diverse perennial base that doesn't need topping up very often. So that's the aim of the annual multi-species, is to be primers to get to a perennial base, if perenniality is wanted in the system. And what I like about the multi-species is they can be tailored, so they're quite flexible. There's a lot of multi-species mixes that can be done up that will suit a particular strategy or scenario on farm. And I've seen them go onto all types of farms, so beef, sheep, cropping, mixed farms, horticulture. You know, there's a mix to suit most situations. So they're very flexible and can be very specific, which is quite nice. So some of the species I put into the mixes, I like to see grasses and cereals in there. Also a little bit of linseed, which is called flax in the US, because they provide a lot of bulk, a lot of high carbon residues, which is good for starting to improve our soil carbon and cycling that, but also for a lot of fibre if we're talking the livestock sense. They're also very good mycorrhizal fungi hosts. So we really want to protect and improve our population of mycorrhizal fungi. They're big soil health drivers, and grasses and cereals do that very well. So I like to see quite a few grasses and cereals in the mix, or a reasonable ratio of them from a seed perspective. So if we're talking about brassicas, I quite like brassicas from a livestock sense for energy and protein. They provide a lot of heavy lifting for the quality part of the diet from a livestock perspective, but they're also very good at scavenging nutrients. So most brassicas have some sort of a taproot. The scale of it depends on the particular species, but they do a lot of nutrient scavenging, especially down into the subsoil. So they're very good in that nutrient cycling aspect. And also because of that taproot, they tend to aerate the soil for us, which is very nice. So brassicas are quite flexible and they do a lot of good for us in a lot of different ways in the mixes. Obviously, legumes give us nitrogen fixation. So the more free nitrogen we can fix from there, the less synthetic fert we have to put on. So I try and include as many legumes as is practical in the mixes. For phosphorus release, cereals are quite good, especially oats and buckwheat, which is a spring through into early autumn active little broadleaf. And it's very good at releasing phosphorus through the action of its roots. And then flowering species as well. I like to see from a biological point of view, quite a few flowering species in the mixes, but they can be something simple like the brassicas we may already have in the mix. Buckwheat is also quite a nice flowering plant. Chicory and sunflowers are really good at attracting pollinators and beneficials. So we like to see that from a biological point of view, but also from a pest management point of view as well. So if we're talking when, because the multi-species are quite flexible, we can sow them really whenever there's enough moisture. Enough moisture and not too much moisture is really when we can sow a multi-species. So apart from the depths of winter, summer, of course, is opportunistic, but any time through autumn and spring, we can sow these mixes because they can be tailored to suit. And we can sow them during a paddock renovation phase. That's quite common. Oversowing low diversity pastures, if the pasture is patchy, we can also do that. If we have a dormant summer species like a native grass or a loosened paddock or something like that, we can oversow autumn active species into that. Or we can take a punt in late spring and summer and sow on an opportunistic rain after silage hay or a grain harvest. So there's quite a few opportunities there throughout the season to fit multi-species into the farming operation. It just depends how it suits you. So there are quite a few opportunities to do so during the year. In autumn and spring, the common species that I like to put in obviously are the brassicas, such as tillage radish, fodder rape and leafy turnip. We can put bulb turnips in there as well. The legumes, vetch and clover, lentils, peas and faba beans are some of the common ones. Bearing in mind, I do a lot of my work in sort of southern Victoria, so these are a suitable species down here and probably up through to sort of Bendigo. Cereals, I use quite a lot of ryegrass and linseed. What I like about the mixes is in autumn and spring, we can put in more diverse mixes and have less risk because of that autumn winter rainfall. So the other point I suppose about this slide is where I've put the asterisks. These particular species, the brassicas, vetch clovers, ryegrass and linseed, they'll all reseed. So if you let them set seed, they'll come back for you to a certain extent the next season or when moisture permits. So it's a good way of making the annual multi-species work for you a bit harder by allowing them to set seed if you'd like them to do so. If you don't, they're reasonably easily controlled, but often it's a bonus, especially in a grazing system, if they do set seed and come back for you. In summer, the common species that I use are millet, brassicas and sunflowers. They're my top three categories. I use a little bit of buckwheat as well, bearing in mind buckwheat can cause a bit of photosensitization. So I do put it in at a fairly low rate, sort of 1 to 2 kilos to the hectare in a mix. There are other opportunities as well for sorghum and grazing maize, bearing in mind that sorghum has some prussic acid issues if we're grazing livestock on it. So in a mix, it shouldn't be too much of a worry, but just to bear that in mind. Grazing maize or corn can be put in, red clover or chicory if the season is wet enough and there's enough moisture. But those are some of the common species. And we'll get to the why now. So I've split this part of the talk into two areas. So we'll talk about the soil health benefits first, and then we'll look at the economics from a profitability point of view. So some of the soil health benefits are increasing diversity, and what we see there is we can accelerate beneficial changes in the system by having multi-species in the paddock rather than a low diversity mix or a monoculture. And we see a lot of nutrient cycling and improvement in soil health much more quickly with a much more diverse mix than we see with a low diversity mix or a monocrop or monopasture. Also, what the multi-species are good at is protecting the soil, supporting our soil biology and increasing soil organic carbon. So our soil organic carbon is crucially important to drive our whole system, and we see the multi-species as a good way to do this. So this is just a quick example. This is Gippsland, a trial that I have over in Gippsland that's ongoing at the moment. And this is just a quick example of how relatively easily it is to increase diversity. So the picture on the left-hand side is a normal ryegrass pasture on a dairy farm. And you can see on the fence line there where the lovely gum tree is that there's a little bit of white flowers and some different looking stuff over there. And the picture on the right-hand side is just a close-up of that paddock. So this is a split paddock trial. We're trialling conventional versus regen in terms of pasture mixes and also fertilising those pasture mixes. So we've got a conventional with synthetic fert applied and a regen with biological fert applied. But this slide is really just to show you how easy it is to just top up that ryegrass with more diverse pasture mixes. So there's obviously tillage radish in here. It's the white flowers looking the goods at the moment, providing a fairly large amount of feed. There's chicory in there. There's a bit of vetch. There's some cereals, although they're looking a little bit drowned out. But there's a reasonable amount of diversity in there, and really all it was adding a few more seeds to the seed box in an autumn sowing. So it's quite easy at certain times of the year to add that diversity to the mix. I've just got a quick question. I will maybe stop for questions just through if they come through, and we'll obviously have time at the end. So this talk will maybe take about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so for questions. But Tom said, do you find the ryegrass continues to dominate? Depends a little bit on the ryegrass. In this particular mix, it didn't, but we changed the ryegrass ratio in that regen mix to being a lower part of the mix, if that makes sense. So we didn't put it in a particularly high rate. I usually put in ryegrass in a multi-species mix at about 5 to 7 kilos out of a 20 to 25 kilo mix. So it goes in at a ratio that we hope will make it not swamp the rest of the mix. So this is the next slide. So this is just an example of ground cover. So what I really like about the multi-species, or there's many things, but this is one of the good ones, is that the mix is really aggressive. So particularly when we're talking annual species, this is a spring sowing mix. You can see there's some sunflowers right at the front here, but you can't really see any ground at all because the mix is so aggressive. So particularly those annual species that I put the mix together for aggressive growing because that's part of what makes the multi-species so advantageous. And this is just an example of how well it covers the ground. So there's really no opportunity for weeds to emerge, and there's a lot of ground cover there and soil protection that we have as well. And certainly later into the season, into our summer months, if there's opportunistic rainfall, we see that ground cover improve, and it starts to really improve soil health by protecting that ground over the warmer months. This is just another example of that. So these were pictures that were sent through in 2018, so a few years ago now, but the premise is probably still the same. So this is another way that we protect the soil biology with the multi-species. So obviously there's ground cover, but there's also keeping a stable temperature, which improves our microbial habitat. So these three pictures just a little digital thermometer. It's got a spike on the ground, just popped into the topsoil. Our Bunyip over the summer in 2018. The picture on the left at 56.5 degrees is bare soil. This is all taken, within half an hour. So 56.5 degrees bare soil, terminated, mulched sort of stubble trampled onto the ground, 48.1 degrees. And the picture on the right-hand side is a living multi-species over that summer at 36 degrees. So a huge difference in soil temp. Further south, over the summer, I've put little temperature buttons into the topsoil, and they do show a similar result in terms of drops in soil temp, although not quite that severe because our summers aren't quite as hot. But certainly there's a real benefit to having that microclimate and those species transpiring and keeping the soil covered and cool in our summer, and potentially warmer in the winter as well. So our microbes like to survive in a certain temperature range. 56.5 degrees is getting pretty hot for them, and they'd be pretty uncomfortable. So we like to keep them as happy and as stable as possible. And part of the way that we can do that, especially in the summer months, if there's an opportunity to do so, is to put a multi-species in that reacts to summer rainfall and keeps our ground covered and cool. So supporting soil biology. So this is a pretty complex area, and I'm just going to cover the real basics of it. But I like to refer to it as the liquid carbon pathway. So this is a term that Christine Jones coined. She's a very knowledgeable soil ecologist and an advocate of multi-species cover crops. And she found that the liquid carbon pathway really means that plants, through the photosynthesis pathway, they trade carbon molecules, liquid carbon, through their root exudates to biology as a food source, and the biology in turn are incentivized to provide nutrients and moisture back to the plant. So it's a positive feedback loop as well. They depend each upon the other, and it really gets our soil biology population working for us and providing moisture and nutrients back to the plant. So the plants feed biology, and the biology in turn feed back to the plants. So what this means from a soil health perspective is that we have a more active soil biological population, and that soil biological population not only gives us moisture and nutrients back to the plant, but it helps improve the soil. So soil biology aggregates soil through various residues. One of them is glomalin, like a soil glue. So it makes the soil more aggregated and more friable. And as that carbon's being pumped into soil, if there's excess carbon that's excess to microbial needs, it actually starts to get stored in the soil. Because the soil is more aggregated, the carbon that's stored there is more stable, and we start to see soil carbon increases as well. So that's driven by that plant and soil biology feedback loop. So obviously, as well as storing carbon, we can also store more moisture and nutrients. As our organic carbon improves, our water holding capacity improves. And as our biological population becomes more active, we start to see a lot more nutrient cycling and more nutrients available from those locked up pools that are inherent in almost all soils. So what we tend to see by encouraging the liquid carbon pathway, and that is by putting more diversity into our mixes, and multi-species are a good way to do that, and also widening up our growing season as well by some opportunistic spring and summer mixes in my part of the world, is that we see that we can support soil biology for a longer period of the year. So we keep a living root in the system, we provide the biology of a food source, and in return, they improve our system. So one opportunity, I suppose, one way to improve soil health is to really focus on improving the conditions for our soil biology in terms of then being able to increase our organic carbon and our fertility and the whole health of our system. So this is a pretty complex area and probably the most complicated of the talk, but it really is worth mentioning because the soil biology, organic carbon, and that diverse mix of species really drives the system from a regen point of view. So we really need to support that soil biology. I've talked a lot about this. So having those multi-species cover the ground for as much of the year as possible, and certainly that's opportunistic in a lot of areas. But with that being the aim, we can start to see deep carbon sequestration as well. For every 1% increase in organic carbon, we have a 2% increase in water holding capacity. So in a dryland system, which most Australian farms are, that's really crucial, and it can really help support the productivity and the resilience of the system. We also see that there's healthier plants as well, because they've got that relationship with soil biology. They're provided nutrients when they incentivise the soil biology to provide them the nutrients. So when they need it, they're provided nutrients and moisture. So we often see that they're healthier. And because we've supported our soil biological system, we see potentially less attack by pathogens and insect pests and all those sorts of things. So we see more resilience in the system as well, with the diversity of plants. So the outcome is that we have a much more resilient farm, potentially with higher fertility, but certainly with enhanced ecosystem function as well. So covers from this sort of sense are a fairly easy way to support soil ecology, because you can just sow them and they'll do most of the heavy lifting for you. And this is because they tick a lot of the principles of soil health. And this is why I got excited about them at university and wanted to see if we could adopt them in Australia, because they tick a lot of the boxes with really little effort from a farmer's part. So the diversity obviously is inherent in a multi-species mix. It's why we call it a multi-species cover crop. The cover part, obviously the multi-species is quite aggressive, and they do respond to rainfall depending on the diversity of the mix at most times of the year. So we see ground cover improving across the season, and certainly in peak growing periods being quite aggressive. So we see a lot of cover on the ground and a lot of residue able to be incorporated back into the ground for soil health. The living plant roots as well, because the mix is diverse and responds to rainfall at various times of the year. We see a lot more living plant roots across a wider part of the season. So we're feeding our soil biology for a lot longer. We can integrate livestock into the system, and that's a really important factor for the system health. And it's easy to do so because the covers are a grazable commodity. So we can integrate livestock into the system if it's not already there. And that livestock really helps the system roll around and perform to its optimum. So having livestock in the system through covers is a fairly easy way to do it. And the disturbance only where necessary. So disturbance does impact our soil biology, and the covers, because they are aggressive, we start to see less weed issues and more ground cover and a friable soil. So the need for cultivation and spraying for weeds and for soil constraints starts to become less when we put these covers into the mixes. So they're really quite an easy way to support soil biology as far as it goes. There's obviously still plenty of management strategies that we have to get our heads around, but as far as it goes, they're a relatively easy way to really support soil biology. No, Mick, I haven't done any work with alternate row sowing to give species their own space. I work mainly in mixed systems or grazing livestock-based systems. So I haven't really done any true work with alternate row sowings. So we'll talk a little bit about the straight economics now. So we've sort of wrapped up soil health a little bit. We'll go back to soil health. I've got some early trial results that I'll share with you, but now we'll talk about economics, and this is more from a profitability point of view rather than a production point of view in some instances. So what the mixes can do for us is they're often high quality feed because of the protein, because of the brassicas and the legumes in there, giving us a lot of protein and energy, and they provide us lots of feed, especially the annual mixes, because they're quite aggressive growers, and they grow sometimes out of season as well. So they provide us more opportunities for feed across a large part of the year, depending on the mix and when it's sown. Using that out of season rainfall can be really advantageous, obviously from reducing a feed gap point of view, but from a soil health point of view in terms of cover, a drought perspective management also from a fire risk, having that green growing biomass around the farm can help to reduce our fire risk as well. So I'll talk about those three things. I've got some examples of those. The other two things that I thought I'd mention is improving risk management. So because it's a multi-species mix, something will usually grow in that mix. So especially from a mixed farming perspective or a livestock perspective, there's more chance to capture feed out of that mix. And in any farming system, there's more opportunity to provide ground cover because something will grow in that mix, or several species out of a mix will grow. So improving the risk management by having more eggs in the basket, so to speak, is an advantage of the multi-species. Another one that I won't dwell on too much, but just something to think about, is a marketing perspective. So having a cleaner, greener image, especially from a livestock image, if we're selling meat or wool or dairy products. There's an amazing amount of goodwill that comes out of having some multi-species mixes and cows in sunflowers and all those sorts of things. And the consumer knowing that we're trying to improve soil health and increase the amount of grazed, homegrown fodder that we're producing for our animals. There's quite a lot of goodwill that comes out of that, and it can improve the system from a marketing perspective as well. So high quality feed, I take a lot of feed tests in the projects, the various projects that I have running sort of through Victoria. I've taken, I would say, 40 feed tests over the last 4 or 5 years, and they all come back in that 10 to 12 ME, so metabolizable energy, and 15 to 25% protein, and that's attributable at most times of the year to the brassicas and the legumes. I use grasses and cereals in the mixes mainly as a fibre source. I don't mind if they become a bit bulky or a bit stemmy, I suppose, because they're really intended as a fibre source in these mixes, because the legumes and the brassicas do all the heavy lifting in terms of quality. So I actually do use grasses and cereals strategically as fibre sources in the mixes. So we do see those high quality fodder tests coming back. So in terms of weight gain and production, there's always an opportunity there because of the quality of the mix. And obviously because of the diversity of the mix, something's always delicious and high quality, at any time of year, and something always provides roughage. So the mix is not only high quality, but also quite balanced in terms of the livestock diet. So lots of feed. So as I've said before, the mixes are quite aggressive. They're quite tough, especially the annual mixes. If they weren't palatable and good for the soil, you'd almost call them weedy mixes. They're so productive and tough, and they really work hard and provide us a lot of feed. So there can be an enormous amount of feed grown from these autumn and winter active mixes. And certainly in the spring and the summer, especially if we contrast them in my area, we've got a winter dominant rainfall pattern. So our production really ends in November and December, and there's not much going on after that in terms of production. So if we can sow a spring and a summer multi-species on an opportunistic rainfall event or into subsoil moisture, if we've had a wet year, we see the production in certainly in the summer months and early autumn months as well, for a feed wedge into winter, being hugely advantageous for any livestock in the system if they happen to be there. So from a cover point of view, there's obviously huge benefits, but especially if you've got livestock in the system, that spring and summer feed for us in southern Victoria is just so advantageous to have, and it doesn't take a lot of biomass to pay off the cost of having a multi-species crop in there. So we do see especially an advantage to spring and summer multi-species if there's an opportunity to put them in. That diversity gives us more production, as I've said, but also more resilience to the system because we are improving soil health along the way. There's obviously lots of feed to be had and high quality feed to be had, but there's soil health benefits that are just rolling on as an additional bonus. From what I've seen over the last few years, the multi-species also seem to handle drier summer conditions better than monocrops. They're usually higher quality than millet or sorghum from a feed perspective. which is quite good, and they're less prone to insect attack than straight brassica crops. I think because, well, for a range of factors, because that diversity doesn't give off the same signals, I suppose, to a predator, you know, like a diamondback or a cabbage moth, and also because the mixes tend to handle those dry summer conditions a little bit better, so they tend not to seem as stressed, they tend not to wilt as early, and I think that's to do with the large species starting to shade the ground covering species and those sorts of things. So there's a canopy effect there that happens as well. And overall, they just seem to handle those summer conditions a little bit better. So there's certainly an advantage there. This is just an example of using some of that out-of-season rainfall to reduce feed gaps. So this is sort of southern and central Victoria, where we have a winter dominant rainfall, and we don't do a lot in December, Jan, Feb, and March, especially from a ryegrass perspective. So this is on a dairy farm, is obviously a fertile soil. I'm about 5'4", that's me in the photo on the left, and this is a 5 hectare paddock, and the ability to grow that multi-species fodder over the summer. Obviously, being in southern Victoria, there's some rainfall about, so this was sown into moisture in about November, and obviously grew very well. This is a pretty diverse mix. So we've got our annual species up here, our sunflowers, and there's millet and sorghum and buckwheat and tillage radish and a lot of other things. But we also have that tillage radish and fodder rape, and there's lucerne in there and a few other brassicas. And they came through, this was grazed off twice over the summer, and they came through in the autumn with no additional top up. And the photo on the right-hand side is the same paddock in mid-May, and he's grazing it off again for the third time with no real need to top it up. So if we can get our spring and summer mixes established, depending on where we are, there's sometimes a need to conserve soil moisture, but if the season is particularly kind or there's not as much of a need to conserve that soil moisture, we can keep that feed wedge going right into autumn, and provide opportunities to graze this while our pasture paddocks are getting going if we're in a livestock-based system. So there's certainly an opportunity, yes, to use that out-of-season rainfall to reduce those feed gaps, but also to create a feed wedge into the autumn as well, and to have two crops really for the price of one. So they're certainly flexible and productive if we can get them going. So some of the results in dry season. So bearing in mind that I do most of my work in sort of central and southern Victoria, but I've put some slides together for some of our drier summer conditions. So Gippsland, this is the paddock I mentioned before. So Gippsland was in a drought right up until January 2020, and they had been from 2016 to 2019, they'd had a pretty rough trot. So this is we sowed the trial in October 2019, millet monoculture next to a 6-way multi-species blend, and even though it's an irrigated farm, we decided this particular set of bays, we weren't too sure how much production we were going to get out off it. So the farmer decided, because irrigation water was so expensive, to irrigate perennial ryegrass instead of the multi-species and the conventional mix, because the establishment was quite compromised and very poor actually. So we decided not to irrigate it. So this was effectively dry land. So the crop established in October and then really did nothing until we had a decent rainfall event, and it was a very decent rainfall event in January. So it established and really grew not at all. We're still pretty much in the seedling stage until January, and in mid-Jan we had 115 mils. So no real rain between establishment and that January rainfall, and it was just an opportunistic summer storm that came through, did give us 115 mils. But certainly our millet, but also the multi-species mix responded amazingly. So I did pasture cuts in early Feb, and had 3.7 tonne off the millet and 4.1 tonne off the multi-species mix. So an enormous ability to respond to summer rainfall there. You can see the protein and the energy do differ. Obviously, the millet, being a grass, is not quite as high quality as the regenerative mix, which included sunflowers and brassicas. So there's quite a lot of certainly protein, but also a bit more energy on the regen side. Our input cost was a little bit higher because I put some perennial chicory into the regen side of the mix. So the seed cost was a little bit higher, but because of that bit of extra production, the cost to produce each kilo of dry matter was actually lower on the regen side, despite the slightly higher cost. So that's just an example of how just the one rainfall event, it doesn't have to be 115 mils, or obviously it'd be lovely if it was, but I've certainly seen fantastic responses from summer active multi-species blends from 1 inch or 2 inches as well. So 115 mils would be fantastic for anyone in summer, but certainly on lower rainfalls, we do still see that responsiveness. These are another few slides. So this is this red line up towards Talbot or northwest of Ballarat, so into some sort of lighter, more gold mining country soil. This was spring sown dry in October in 2020. It had 30 mil after that through October, and that established the crop. It got the crop up and away. No rain at all November to February. It was grazed in January, so he had some lambs on there. This particular farmer is a sheep farmer. He had some lambs on there. It's an 8-hectare paddock, so he didn't get a massive amount of feed off, but he did get a grazing off it. In Feb, we had 18 mil. In March, we had 22 mil, then 2 showers of 2.5 mil each. So not a massive amount of rain, but he got a reasonable grazing off it in January, and then another light grazing off it before he put a winter multi-species in it. So certainly a dry sowing and then not a fantastically wet summer still gave him some opportunities to feed some lambs. Clunes in 2020. So this is a split paddock trial. So you can see the fence line pretty much splits the paddock in half. So the left-hand side is the conventional, and the right-hand side is the multi-species. And this is looking at it from I suppose a cost perspective. So the conventional side was sown in October. This is the farmer's mix on the conventional side that he put in. So mammoth, purple top turnip, fodder rape, millet and barley. He also fertilised it. These are the costs, so $371 a hectare for the seed and the fert. In February, he had grown 2.2 tonnes of feed. On the regen side, I sowed a multi-species mix, but it was at a much lower sowing rate, and that actually proved advantageous. We had a reasonably dry summer. And that lower sowing rate was about 1/3 of the sowing rate of the conventional side. And it did show up in terms of productivity, I suppose, because there were less plants on that side. They all had a bit more moisture to grow. We also had a lot lower fertilising costs because we just used Nutrisoil and a compost extract, first as a seed coating and then as a once-off foliar spray. So our costs were quite a bit lower. Our production was actually a bit higher. So there's just an opportunity there perhaps to grow something a little bit different and maybe fertilise it a little bit differently for a more cost-effective result perhaps. This is colac in 2021. So this is down sort of at my neck of the woods. This is a problem paddock for the farmer, and he chose to use multi-species to try and ameliorate some of those problems. So it's a sandy soil with a buckshot layer. Organic carbon is reasonable, but pH is 5 in calcium chloride, so reasonably acidic. Low nitrogen, phosphorus. Coal LP was about 4, so sort of low nutrient availability. Low CEC as well, high iron soils because of that buckshot. So this paddock was sown late November. November we had no rain at all. December we had 12 mils. Jan again we had an opportunistic set of summer storms and we had 111 mils. And in February we had 1 mil. So apart from having that opportunistic summer storm, the multi-species got up on really no rain and hung on until January, and then grew us quite a reasonable amount of feed, considering this is a bit of a problem paddock. So I did some cuts here on the 1st of March, and he had about 2.4 tonne of feed on this paddock. So just that ability to respond to that summer rainfall, especially in a paddock that's been quite tough. So this was the problem paddock for the farmer that he couldn't really get a lot of production off. So the multi-species is doing reasonably well in those types of conditions. So some of the work that I've been doing, obviously I'm really interested in what's happening in terms of organic carbon. So that's a key driver for me, and something that I really keep an eye on in the trials. So these are just some early results. So this is a Southern Farming Systems trial a few years ago, 2017. And this was a split paddock trial, split into 4, and a summer trial. So there was a fallow area where the paddock was cut for silage and then nothing was done. This is in a livestock grazing system. Then the farmer put in 2 strips of one of corn and one of grazing maize, and then a summer max, which is a 4-way blend from AGF. So not a particularly diverse mix. But we can see the organic carbon change. This was just over the summer. So this was also grazed and grazed reasonably heavily. He's a beef finishing operation. So he wanted to get a reasonable amount of value out of that biomass. So he grazed his paddock reasonably hard. So there wasn't a massive amount of residue left. But we can see the organic carbon increased most in our summer max, our multi-species mix. Obviously, our nutrients diminished in comparison to the fallow in all 3 of our other treatment strips, but to a lesser extent, again, in our multi-species mix. So potentially more nutrient cycling. We had tillage radish and fodder rape in here. So being brassicas with taproots, they'll start to scavenge nutrients from the subsoil, potentially, and potentially this is why we had less nutrient use over the summer in this treatment compared to our monocrops. But certainly the change in organic carbon is one to watch as well. It was a very encouraging trend 5 years ago to see this sort of change happening just over the summer, and certainly advantageous for the system. So an early trend, but a good trend. So building on that trend, the Gippsland project that's still ongoing that I mentioned before, we've had some soil organic carbon changes there as well. And we're starting to see, I've got a project in southwest Victoria, 20 to 30 farms in that project, depending on the particular branch of the project. And we're starting to see some organic carbon increases in there. So this is actually the soil test on the right-hand side from the Gippsland project. It's quite a nice red loamy soil, but it was laser graded just before this project started. And the project really, I wanted to answer the question of whether those negative changes in soil health from the laser grading could be ameliorated more quickly or more successfully through a regen approach than the normal conventional approach. So that's why the project started. So the soil obviously took quite a lot of damage through the laser grading process. And we can see the baseline soil tests here. So we can see our organic carbon is what we're really focusing on. Obviously, from a production perspective, we're keeping an eye on pasture production, but the organic carbon and the associated soil health, we're really keeping an eye on in this project. So we took baseline soil tests just before the project started, and at the end of the annual phase, we've moved to a perennial multi-species and a perennial ryegrass clover mix on the conventional side. And we took some ending soil tests after that annual phase. So there were 3 lots of sowings in the annual phase, and we can see that there's not a lot of change in the 0 to 10, the top soil organic carbon, but in the conventional 10 to 30, we found some changes. So conventionally managed, the organic carbon actually dropped just a bit, but on the regen side, we saw it increase from 2.5% to 4%. So that's using multi-species mixes and also fertilising them biologically. And we saw a huge amount of change. So this is only obviously one trial and early days, but it's certainly an encouraging trend. On Kooramungal, this is southwest Victoria, south of Camperdown or south of Warrnambool, if that helps you understand where I am. And a really heavy black clay soil, quite wet, cracks in summer, crickets everywhere, has its advantages, but also its challenges. And we put a perennial based multi-species mix in and measured the carbon just before, and then just before the multi-species mix went in. And every 2 years, this farmer is planning to terminate the multi-species mix and then sow it again. So every second spring, he'll go in and top up that multi-species mix. So we took soil tests before the first multi-species went in and just before the second multi-species was going to be sown. And we had an increase in organic carbon of 1%. So on a heavy black clay soil where the soil organic carbon is about 5% anyway, we still saw an increase in organic carbon. So these are really early changes, but they're starting to stack up a little bit in terms of seeing organic carbon increases. So still from a paddock scale trial point of view, it's not, when I'm not wearing a lab coat when I'm out there, it's not a rigorous small plot experiment, but certainly from a paddock scale viewpoint and results base, there are starting to be some trends to increase organic carbon under these multi-species mixes. So that's quite exciting. One of the reasons why I think we are seeing the changes is that we're actually having a change in management now. So the multi-species mix is not something that any of these farmers really did before. So they had an organic carbon level on their farm, I believe, that was reflective of their management level if they'd been managing the same way for 5 to 10 years or longer, and that organic carbon level had sort of plateaued under their current management system. And it was the change in management going to a multi-species mix, I believe, that allowed for that change in soil health and organic carbon. So just something to think on. So covers in the Wimmera or covers in the north. Obviously, if you've got stock make covers a lot less risky due to that grazing value. So we see a lot of weight gain off the covers because of their quality. So it's not uncommon for beef cattle to do 1.5 to 2 kilos a day on these multi-species mixes. So stocks certainly make those covers much less risky. So the input costs can be more than covered by the weight gain or the production in other ways of those covers. So use your rainfall and your species strategically if you're in a drier environment, and probably do some autumn covers first before attempting summer multi-species. So that's partly to build confidence and build the knowledge base around doing a multi-species, but also to build soil health and organic carbon first before a summer multi-species is attempted in a lower rainfall environment. So certainly where soil carbon is a little bit low. If you do want to do a summer multi-species or a spring sown multi-species, capitalise on those early paddocks. So a crop paddock or a short-lived annual pasture would be the way to go, or wait for an opportunistic summer storm. So if you've got a little bit of seed in the shed and there's a really good chance of a summer storm coming through and it's backed right up, it's only a couple of days out, possibly go sowing then. But certainly if you can capitalise on some early moisture in the spring, do so if you'd like, if you're confident, or wait for that storm and just have a bit of seed sitting in the shed. If there's seed sitting in the shed and you don't get that summer storm, it'll survive till the next year, but certainly it's a good opportunity just to have it waiting in the shed. What to sow? So obviously, as I've said before, certainly more diversity in the autumn mixes. 6 to 15 way blends is fine, depending on the paddock, the constraints you're wanting to address, whether you're wanting to finish livestock, all those sorts of things. Keep the cost down for summer. So I certainly do that down here, and I would certainly do it further north. So low diversity mixes are just fine. So that 5 to 8 species is more than enough, with fairly low inputs if you can get away with it. So millet, your fodder rape, tillage radish, sunnies and buckwheat. Buckwheat, again, that 1 to 2 kilos is plenty. It's more for a soil health perspective than a fodder perspective, so keep it at a fairly low rate. If you need to terminate that summer cover, so either graze it off or spray it out. if you need to conserve some moisture. So if you've got it up and growing and you think it's starting to impact or will impact your autumn crop in terms of starting soil moisture, certainly terminate it. If you really want to keep cover on that paddock, probably spray it out rather than graze it out. Or if you're grazing it out, leave a certain amount of residue so that you still have that soil cover. Certainly in the summer, certainly in the autumn, I suppose, and depending on the cost of boarding feed, it doesn't take a lot of biomass off these multi-species to cover the seed costs and then have that bonus of improving soil health. So 1 to 2 tonne of feed is plenty to cover your seed costs. With a really low diversity summer mix, it's much closer to 1 tonne of feed that will cover the seed costs. So there doesn't have to be a lot of return to be covering your bases there in terms of input costs. So I suppose the summary of the talk is obviously multi-species are quite flexible. There's a lot of possible benefits from them, and I've outlined a few today. The dry matter changes and the organic carbon changes are measurable. So from a grazing days perspective, or just visually by eye looking at a dry matter production, you can see those changes. They are certainly measurable just from observation, but measurable also from a trials perspective. If you do go that way with cuts and other assessments. Organic carbon changes are measurable, it just requires you to have a baseline soil test and then monitor over time. There's an opportunity to grow valuable feed and reduce feed gaps if you have livestock in the system. And I can't stress the importance enough of the plant diversity, the organic carbon, keeping an eye on your organic carbon and building it if you possibly can, and helping to protect and support your soil biology. So they really drive this regen system, and they're the 3 main things from a management perspective that really help the system become more productive and more resilient and ultimately more profitable. So really focusing on those 3 factors will help you make your regen system successful. So that's it, Dan, for me. Happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jade. That was fantastic. Yeah, do we want to spend 15 minutes on question time now?
Sure.
I see we've got a few questions there. Are you happy to run through those and answer them on the screen as Jade's answering? If you've got any more questions, if you can use the Q&A segment or button down the bottom there, type your questions in and Jade will answer away. So yeah, over to you, Jade, to get going on the question time.
Thanks, Dan. All right, so I've just pulled up the Q&A session. So Brent's asked, are there any plants you're aware of that can suppress weeds that emerge amongst the cover crop? We get paddock grass and bindii, which cause issues. So that is a little bit of a problem with the species because there's not a lot of, because the mix is quite diverse, there's not a lot of opportunity for post-emergent control. Because you'll invariably knock out something in the mix, if not quite a few somethings. So it is a little bit of a trouble. I don't really have, so there's some information on allelopathic tendencies of various plants that will suppress weeds, but it's not a real exact science with the multi-species. So sorghum apparently should do it, and ryegrass should do it a little bit too. I haven't used those species in that sense particularly. My advice would be to go into a paddock that has less weed issues. So you've controlled the paddock or prepped the paddock first, and then so if you are aware that there'll be weeds in the seed bank, sowing those multi-species at a really high rate. So, and certainly over time, I think as the soil health changes, the weeds will become less of an issue. But it's from the work I've done to date, I haven't worked on anything that will just suppress weeds as such, that we can put into a cover crop that will do that function for us from the get-go. So it's more a question of managing the paddock prior to sowing the multi-species, so there's perhaps not as many of those issues, and then being quite aggressive with the sowing rate, especially in, well, if we can in autumn and winter, and creating that smothering ability, and into the spring and the summer, keeping that cover on the ground from that multi-species mix, so we have less germination opportunities as well. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. No, I haven't done a lot of true weed suppression work in terms of an allelopathic tendency, I try and go into medium to good paddocks in terms of weeds and sow the cover crop fairly heavily to combat that. And hopefully what weeds that do come up will just decrease over time. I have started to see weed decreases over time, but it does depend on the individual paddock as well. Beverly's asking at what depth was the carbon measured. So in terms of the Gippsland trial paddock, we're doing 0 to 10, 10 to 30, and then 30 to 60. But most of my other trials are 0 to 10s and 10 to 30. So the Cooramungal soil and the first 2017 result that I showed, they were actually 0 to 10s, but most of my trials are 0 to 10 and 10 to 30. Rhonda's asked what are your thoughts of crimping the multi-species in spring prior to flowering and then sowing back into it. I really like the idea, Rhonda, of roller crimping, but the multi-species mix can be quite tricky because of the diversity of the mix. The grasses are a little bit trickier to crimp, and so are legumes, depending on their stage. If you've got cereals in there and they're going ahead and their stem is quite hard, there's an opportunity to crimp those. But in terms of completely suppressing that multi-species crop in spring and then sowing back into it, I haven't yet seen any truly successful work from a multi-species point of view. Having said that, Southern Farming Systems are doing a bit of work on this, and I know there are farmers with their own roller crimpers, but I haven't seen it be too successful just yet. Because of that diversity in the mix, unfortunately, there's different plants at different growth stages and varying degrees of success. Emily, any comments on controlling slugs and snails in establishing multi-species using direct drill or soil key approaches? If slugs and snails are a real issue, hopefully there's spring and summer moisture there. Probably what I would do is try, and if you're in a medium to high rainfall zone, is establish the multi-species in spring, and then your brassicas particularly and your legumes are quite robust once the slugs and the snails start to come out in autumn. So that's probably one way around slugs and snails, is making sure your brassicas in particular are well established by the time they become active. I don't have any true, there's no real controlling, I suppose, alternatives in terms of multi-species. I think that's certainly a growth stage will have a certain part to play in it, so you can strategically have your brassicas up and going before and robust before slugs and snails appear. But it's just something we have to deal with, I suppose, with these multi-species. If it's autumn sown and there's a fair few brassicas in it, slugs and snails are going to be an issue. So it's an individual paddock basis then as to how we do that. Michael, yes, I have got data on animal performance. We'll talk about that a little bit next week, sorry. So next week, the session will be mostly farmer viewpoints from the north, but I'll talk first or last, I don't really mind. Dan and I haven't sorted that out, but I'll talk a little bit on the animal performance and some of the weight gains on multi-species. I don't, well, there are a few slides that are multi-species versus mono, but there's certainly a few slides that are just multi-species, and there's weight gain performance on those, but there are some multi-species versus mono. From a trials perspective, I have a lot of farms that are doing only a few paddocks of the multi-species, and they're not massive areas because we're in central and southern Victoria for the most part. So weight gain from a trials perspective, from a truly measured perspective, I haven't done as much because they're relatively small areas, but I have got a little bit of data on that. I have got some slides certainly with just multi-species weight gains there, so we'll talk about that next week. Tony, can you please explain the flux capacitor? So the flux capacitor, or the cultivation calculator, is something that Heytesbury Landcare, who I'm working with as a multi-species advisor, it's come out of their work with using low till machines in a high rainfall environment to establish multi-species, and direct drilling or soil keying straight into active pastures. And there was quite a lot of competition from our pasture base. This was a spring sowing. Our first round of sowings was late spring, and we had a lot of competition from our existing pasture base. So the cultivation calculator was going around and analysing those pastures and determining why they didn't work. And Heytesbury has come up with a cultivation calculator that takes the key factors that we thought were most important in terms of determining the success or the failure of the multi-species in those instances, and giving a recommendation on the level of tillage needed to establish a successful multi-species. So that cultivation calculator will be available shortly from Heytesbury Landcare. There'll be a Zoom session, I believe, to launch it and to make it available. So look out for that. We might try and broadcast it through the VicNoTill as well, so you can all see it. So it's just it may or may not be handy, but certainly some feedback from our farmers has been that it's been quite handy to give them a pathway to successfully establishing a multi-species, especially when they have a pasture base there already. Mick, there's a lot of rhetoric out there suggesting grazing covers will shift systems a lot quicker. Has this been your experience? And have you done any trials to measure the effect? I haven't done I think what you're asking is whether multi-species alone and versus multi-species grazed has been tested side by side. I presume that's what you're asking, Mick. I work a lot with grazing systems, or certainly mostly grazing systems, some mixed farmers, cropping and livestock. So they do just graze the multi-species regardless. So I don't really have any trial. But we did talk yesterday. I've got a trial site up at Clunes that I mentioned earlier in the talk. We did talk there about potentially drilling down into the trial and establishing a grazed and a non-grazed multi-species so that we can measure that effect. But for the rest of the trials, because they're in a grazing system, we do just graze those covers as a matter of course, if that makes sense. So I personally don't have any trials that measure an ungrazed multi-species versus a grazed multi-species to see whether there's any quick shifts, whether grazing can really help. So I don't have that data. Paul, I think this is more a comment than a question. So management's difficult when in a mixed farming situation. That's very true. Balancing grazing, cover, termination, quantity versus quality, managing problem cropping weeds such as ryegrass is full of compromises. That's certainly true, Paul. Cropping, in a grazing sense, the multi-species is a lot easier to manage, and certainly terminating it and grazing it and not having those problem weeds. Annual ryegrass in a grazing system is just fine. So certainly I understand exactly where you're coming from. When you introduce cropping into the system, it becomes a lot more difficult to manage that multi-species and to make it work successfully.
Very good. I think that's the end of the questions. Conscious of time, we're up on the hour. So I'd really like to thank you, Jade, for your time. Very fascinating insight into cover cropping and multi-species mixes. To me, something that come across very strong is how easy it is to add diversity into our enterprises. Whether we're grazing or whether we're cropping, it's very easy to add that diversity. But also great to see your trials to see how multi-species actually can improve our soil organic carbon. We all know the benefits to improve soil organic carbon levels, but it's something that's front of mind in a lot of farmers at the moment in terms of all this talk with net zero and potential revenue streams off farm or diversifying our enterprises in terms of selling carbon credits and that sort of thing. So very, very valuable insights there. So a really big thank you again to the Wimmera CMA through funding from the Australian Government National Landcare Program. We'd really like to thank you for your support. Just a bit of housekeeping before we wrap up. If you enjoyed today's webinar, be sure to catch the next one. The advertisement and the link will be up on social media and advertised through the CMA today for you to register for next week. The next one with Jade, as she said, we'll be talking with a few farmers and that sort of thing about their experiences with cover cropping and multi-species pastures, and that will be on next Thursday, same time, 7 a.m. So we hope to see you all there. We're going to send a survey out to everyone that attended today. It will be emailed to you. We're just looking to gain feedback from the webinar so that we can make any improvements into the future to make it a better experience for you guys. And there was a question there that I did answer from Anne that asking about a recording of this webinar. We are recording it, and it will be up on the VicNoTill YouTube channel for everyone to see. So we'd like to thank everyone for your attendance today. We'd really like to thank Jade, thank the Wimmera CMA and Landcare for their support. So we hope to see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.